Arcane's women are flawed, and that's a good thing. You know what I found really mind-boggling these past few years? That people lost their minds over a new trope called the strong female character. If you've spent some time on YouTube, you may know that not all of these characters have been well received. But that's not what I found so confusing about this. No, what irritated me was that many people were treating these characters as if the creators did something new and super progressive. Okay? Actually, there have been a lot of strong female characters in the past. Like pretty much the entire female cast of Avatar: The Last Airbender or Fullmetal Alchemist, both of which aired more than 10 years ago. Unlike a lot of the more recent strong female characters, these older characters were allowed to have glaring flaws and to fail, which made them so much more relatable. And the way I see it, that also made for much more interesting role models. I mean, think about it. Would you rather young girls learn from fiction about how to deal with failure, overcome your flaws and emerge victorious? Or do you think it's better to show them almost flawless human beings who either never fail or if they do, don't have to deal with the consequences? So yeah, that's something I really loved about Arcane. They don't shy away from giving all characters glaring flaws. I've already talked about a big part of the male cast in my video on the scientists of Arcane. There I already explored what made these characters so fascinating to me. That's why in this video I want to focus on the female part of the cast. When you think of a strong female character in Arcane, Vi is probably the first who comes to mind. She fights like a tank and often lets her fists speak for her. However, she's not limited to being a brute. She also shows her soft side, especially when she's around Powder, whom she always tries to encourage. As a child, Vi is a natural alpha, but still needs to figure out a lot of stuff about leadership. In that regard, she serves as a mirror to Vander, who already learned his lessons and became a strong leader for his people in Zaun. A point that is hammered home by him and Vi using the same fighting style and weapon. Unlike Vander, Vi is still inexperienced though when it comes to being a leader. When she wants to go save Vander, of course the others follow her. But Vi didn't know how to lead her party properly. Most obvious, if Vi really trusted in Powder's abilities, as she kept telling her, she would have given her a job instead of leaving her behind. I mean, Powder is much better at hitting a target with a gun than Milo, for example. She could have been quite useful by giving her friends cover. But because Powder's strengths are so different from her own, Vi didn't know how to use her properly on this mission. Also, she should have known her sister well enough that leaving her behind was not a smart move, even though she only meant well. So when things went horribly wrong, I couldn't help but wonder what could have been if Vi had taken Powder with them. But instead, everything Vander warned her about came to pass. Vi lost Milo and Clagger, and eventually even Powder. As Vander said, being a leader means whatever happens, it's on you. So since she was the leader, Vi blames herself for what happened to her team. That's why once she gets out of prison in Act 2, Vi is reluctant to really team up with Caitlyn to search for Silco, but rather wants to do things on her own. For other reasons than Vi, Caitlyn usually prefers to work on her own too. Due to her family station, she grew up in a somewhat isolated manner. She often assumes that the people around her have been manipulated by her parents or act a certain way because she carries the name Kiriman. At work, she seems to have a hard time fitting in with her colleagues because they only see a spoiled rich girl in her instead of getting to know her for real. Ironically, Caitlyn herself does the same thing with Zaunites. She spent a lot of time uncovering crime in Zaun, and doesn't see much more in them than criminals once she and Vi get down there. When Vi and Caitlyn start working together, at first they're having a hard time trusting each other and both want to do things their way. Both have their reservations about each other, since Vi doesn't like topsiders and Caitlyn is a bit wary of Zaunites. That Caitlyn isn't as open towards the real world as she likes to think is shown really well when Vi looks at her old home and Caitlyn casually says that the place looks like a lot of bodies are buried there. A completely superficial assessment without knowing the history of the place. Caitlyn didn't mean to, but her words hurt Vi more than she knows. Caitlyn's biggest flaw is that even though she hates that others don't see past her family name, she herself has a hard time looking past certain stereotypes. But the more Vi and Caitlyn get to see things from each other's point of view, at some point they start to understand that their worldview had been too narrow, and once they open up to each other, they become a really good team. Just like Powder and Vi, Caitlyn and Vi have very different strengths. Caitlyn is not as physically strong as Vi, but she's a great shot. At one point, Vi would have been a goner if Caitlyn didn't shoot at Sevika, who was about to kill Vi. Something Powder could have done to help on their mission to save Vander. Just saying. Also, even though she'd been working alone at that point and didn't leave Piltover, Caitlyn was able to gather so much intelligence in Silco that even Vi was impressed. In that regard, Caitlyn serves as a mirror to the corrupted Marcus, who secretly works with Silco because he thinks that's the right thing to do, since his predecessor also struck a deal with Vander. A lesser show would have depicted Marcus as a corrupt bad guy who was only out for his personal gain. And don't get me wrong, he's not likable. He really is kind of a prick, especially at the beginning. But the show tells us enough about him and his circumstances that he doesn't come off as a cheap way to glorify Caitlyn's character. But due to the path he chose, whenever Marcus gets wind of Caitlyn being on Silco's trail, he puts stones in her way. That Caitlyn got as far as she got in her investigation can be attributed to her strong determination and sense of justice. Something she shares with Vi, and the foundation for their great teamwork. I really enjoyed the relationship between those two. And I appreciate that the writers acknowledged that they only knew each other for a limited period of time, and didn't rush the relationship. I'm curious how they will work out the events at the end of this season in the next one, but I hope we get to see Vi and Caitlyn getting closer. However, I doubt Jinx would wish for the same thing. I already talked about Jinx and why she's jealous of Caitlyn in another video, so I'll keep this section short. Throughout the 3 acts, Jinx's character shows a clear progression. In the first act, she's the innocent little powder. At the end of Act 1, Jinx is born. But until Act 3, she has not fully embraced her Jinx persona. There is still a bit of the old powder left in her. But after her brush with death and treatment with Shimmer, she leaves her old self even farther behind, until she fully becomes Jinx at the end of Act 3. Powder desperately wanted to catch up to Vi and be as strong as her. At the end of Season 1, no one could say that Jinx is weaker than Vi, but she paid one hell of a price to get there. And maybe I'm reading too much into this, but I think that giving her the name Powder was no coincidence. By removing just one letter, her name turns into Power, which is what she desperately wants. But not everyone is willing to pay such a hefty price for power. Mel was banished by her own mother, Ambassa, from their kingdom because she wasn't ruthless enough. In a way, Ambassa is actually similar to Silco. She promised Mel the throne if she can prove that she can take it. Kind of like Silco said that real power doesn't come to those who were born strongest, smartest, or fastest. It comes to those who will do anything to achieve it. At first, Mel comes off as the temptress who wants to use Jace for her own agenda. And to a certain degree, that is absolutely correct. I think her mother's words still haunt her, and that after being banished, she still feels like she needs to prove that she can take the throne. Therefore, Mel has high ambitions for her position in Piltover. She wants to prove to herself, and maybe even her mother, that she's capable of reaching the top by her own means. But her family's teachings have not left her unscathed. That's why she wants Jace and Victor to weaponize Hextech to keep Piltover safe from Zaun once Jinx stole a Hextech crystal on Progress Day. In that regard, her line of thinking isn't that much different from her mother. However, Mel never wanted to create these kinds of weapons to use them on a preemptive strike. She only wanted to have them as countermeasures to be able to defend Piltover if the worst case scenario were to occur. However, her mother was right. Once you build a weapon, it will be used. And that's exactly what happened. I love how the inner conflict between those two women is also shown in their appearance. Mel is elegant and feminine, while her muscular mother even puts Jace's abs to shame. I really appreciate that the show didn't reduce Mel to the role of a femme fatale seducing men to do her bidding. At the beginning of the show, I expected her to be just that and that she'd tempt Jace to choose the wrong path. However, in the end, it was Ambassa who seduced Jace into using Hextech as a weapon, and Mel actually tried to stop him from going too far. So yeah, what this boils down to, if all these characters had been flawless, the story would not exist. And of course, this is not limited to the female cast. All male characters are just as flawed and are just as responsible for the conflict in Arcane, showing that no demographic is better or worse than the other. I love how much depth each of these characters were given and that I never thought that the writers were trying to follow a political agenda. I'm really grateful they didn't spoon feed us cheap girl power. Instead, they gave us interesting characters with meaningful character arcs, who felt like real people. I'd love to hear your thoughts on these characters, so please let me know in the comments. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please leave a like and maybe even check out my other videos on Arcane. And thank you so much for watching this one. Anyway, farewell.